All right, guys, something just snapped inside the global tech system, and most people completely missed it. A major US tech giant did not make a bold, visionary move. It made a forced move, a survival move, and when you zoom out, this decision tells us far more about the state of American technology than it does about China, because this was not about innovation. It was about pressure. It was about time running out. For years, the story was simple. The United States builds the most advanced AI models. The world follows. Capital floods in. Valuations soar. And dominance feels permanent. But now that story is breaking down in real time. What just happened is a signal that one of the core assumptions holding up the US tech narrative is starting to fail. The assumption that money alone can buy time. The assumption that scale guarantees control. The assumption that if you build enough models, the applications will eventually appear. That assumption no longer holds. And this is why the trigger was pulled now, not later, not after more experiments. Now. Because the pressure is compounding from every direction at once. Investors are no longer patient. Borrowing is no longer cheap. And the global market is no longer waiting. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow, structural squeeze finally becoming visible. And here's the part that really matters. This is not happening in isolation. It is happening at the exact same moment that China is proving it can scale real-world technology faster, cheaper, and with fewer constraints. That contrast is lethal. When one system depends on future promises and the other depends on current cash flow, time stops being neutral. Time becomes a weapon. And right now, time is not on the side of US tech giants. That is the context behind this decision. It was not aggressive, it was defensive, it was a recognition that the old playbook is no longer enough. And once that realization sets in, everything else starts to look very different. Because when the leader starts reacting instead of shaping, the game has already shifted. And that shift is exactly what we are going to unpack. Now let us talk about the first pillar that is starting to crack. And that is the financial engine behind American AI. Over the past few years, the scale of investment has been historic. Data centers, specialized chips, energy contracts, entire regions rewired to support computation. Big tech firms have poured tens of billions of dollars each year into AI infrastructure, and the numbers keep climbing. On paper, it looks unstoppable. But underneath that growth is a fragile assumption that capital will always be available at a tolerable cost. That assumption is no longer safe. Interest rates remain elevated. Credit conditions are tightening, and at the same time, the US government itself needs to refinance trillions of dollars in debt. That means competition for capital is intensifying everywhere. When capital becomes scarce, it stops rewarding ambition and starts demanding discipline. And this is where the problem begins. AI is capital intensive in a way very few industries are. It requires massive upfront spending with uncertain timelines for return. That was acceptable when money was cheap and confidence was high. It becomes dangerous when investors start asking hard questions. Where is the cash flow? Where is the margin? Where is the proof this scales into profit? And here is the uncomfortable reality. Much of the AI boom in the US has been justified by future potential rather than present performance. That gap is now being scrutinized. Investors are no longer impressed by capacity alone. They want results. And when they do not see them, valuations correct brutally. This is why tech stocks have come under pressure even during an AI boom. The market is signaling something very clearly. Capital expenditure without monetization is no longer rewarded. It is penalized. And this creates a feedback loop. As valuations fall, borrowing becomes harder. As borrowing becomes harder, investment slows. As investment slows, the growth narrative weakens. This is not a collapse. It is a tightening spiral. And that spiral is forcing companies to make decisions they would have avoided just a year ago. Decisions driven not by strategy, but by necessity. 10-2. Here's the deeper problem that makes all of this unavoidable. The United States is exceptionally good at building AI models, but far less effective at turning those models into durable revenue. There are plenty of impressive systems, chatbots, assistants, creative tools, but most of them rely on the same narrow monetization channel, subscriptions. And subscriptions have limits. You can only sell so many $20 or $50 plans before saturation sets in. Enterprises are cautious. Consumers are selective, and competition is intense. This creates a monetization ceiling that many investors are now openly questioning. Meanwhile, the cost side of the equation keeps rising. Training and running large models consumes enormous amounts of compute and energy. Margins shrink fast if usage grows without corresponding revenue. This is why the idea that frontier models will automatically generate massive profits is being quietly abandoned. Models are becoming commodities. Once that happens, differentiation shifts away from intelligence and toward application, and this is where US tech finds itself exposed. There are not enough high-value, high-volume applications deployed at scale. There are plenty of demos, plenty of pilots, plenty of promises, but not enough products that businesses cannot live without. The market is noticing. That is why investor sentiment has turned. That is why market capitalization across the tech sector has dropped sharply, despite constant AI headlines. The message is simple. Intelligence alone is not value. Utility is. And if you cannot convert intelligence into workflows, savings, or revenue, the model does not matter. This realization is spreading fast inside Silicon Valley. And once it sets in, it changes behavior. Companies stop waiting. They stop experimenting endlessly. They start acquiring, integrating, buying solutions that already work. That is the pressure driving the decision we started with. It is not about admiration for foreign technology. It is about closing a monetization gap before the market closes it for you. And once you see that clearly, the rest of this story becomes almost inevitable. Now let us flip the lens and look at the system that is quietly applying pressure from the other side, because this story makes no sense unless you understand why China is moving so differently. While the United States has been scaling AI through capital intensity, China has been scaling it through cost, discipline, and structural advantage. The most important factor here is not talent or ambition. It is energy. Chinese data centers operate with access to cheaper and more predictable power, and that changes everything. When electricity costs are low and stable, running compute-heavy workloads stops being an existential risk and becomes a planning variable. On top of that, Chinese tech firms borrow at far lower rates, often with policy backing that absorbs downside risk. That means they can deploy infrastructure without the same urgency to show immediate returns. But here's the critical distinction. This is not blind spending. It is tightly linked to application. Chinese AI investment is focused less on building the biggest model and more on embedding intelligence into workflows that already exist. Manufacturing, logistics, finance, customer service, urban management. These are not experiments. They are operational systems. When AI is plugged directly into production, it generates value even if the model itself is not cutting edge. That is why scale in China looks quieter but compounds faster. While US firms chase breakthroughs, Chinese firms chase deployment, and deployment creates cash flow creates endurance. This is the part many analysts underestimate. China does not need to win the intelligence race to win the economic race. It needs to win the application race. And that race is measured in margins, not benchmarks. As a result, China can tolerate slower model improvement because the system pays for itself along the way. This is why the build first monetize later approach works there but strains the US system. The costs are lower, the feedback loops are shorter, and the market is massive. When you put all of this together, you start to see why time favors one side more than the other. One system burns capital waiting for payoff. The other recycles capital as it grows. That difference does not show up in headlines. It shows up in balance sheets. And balance sheets decide who survives long term. 10-4. This brings us to the moment that truly unsettled the global AI conversation, because it exposed how fragile assumed advantages really are. For years, restrictions on advanced chips were expected to slow Chinese progress dramatically. The logic was simple: limit access to hardware and development stalls. What actually happened was very different. Faced with constraints, Chinese researchers focused on efficiency, software-level optimization, smarter training methods, lower power consumption. This is where the DeepSeek moment enters the picture. Instead of trying to match brute force with brute force, the approach shifted toward doing more with less. The result was a class of models that could run on less advanced chips while maintaining competitive performance for many real-world tasks. That has enormous implications. If models can be trained and deployed efficiently without top-tier hardware, the value of hardware dominance erodes quickly. This is not a theoretical risk. It directly threatens the economic logic of the US chip ecosystem. High margins depend on indispensability, efficiency undermines that, and the second-order effect is even more destabilizing. When efficiency improves, deployment accelerates. Lower energy demand means more systems can run simultaneously. More systems mean more applications mean faster learning cycles. This creates a compounding loop that does not rely on frontier hardware. That is why this moment matters. It shows that sanctions can reshape innovation rather than stop it. Instead of freezing progress, they redirected it. And once that redirection succeeds, it cannot be reversed easily. The shock is not that China is catching up. It is that the path it chose is structurally resilient. Even if access to advanced chips improves later, the efficiency gains remain. That permanently changes the competitive landscape. This is why U.S. firms are nervous. Their advantage was supposed to be unassailable. Now it looks conditional. And when an advantage becomes conditional, strategic behavior changes immediately. To understand where this trajectory leads, you only need to look at $1 trillion market where the outcome is already visible, and that is electric vehicles. This is the clearest example of how application-focused strategy beats headline technology. Chinese EV makers did not win by building the most advanced cars on paper. They won by building cars people could afford at scale. They optimized supply chains, cut costs relentlessly, and flooded the market with options across every price tier. Domestic competition forced efficiency. That efficiency translated into global dominance. Even with tariffs and restrictions, Chinese EVs continue to expand internationally because the value proposition is overwhelming. Meanwhile, Western incumbents remain trapped between high costs and shrinking margins. This matters because AI is starting to follow the same pattern. The lesson from EVs is not about batteries or motors. It is about system design. When a country controls manufacturing, energy, logistics, and domestic demand, it can absorb shocks and still scale. That is exactly what China has built. AI applications benefit from the same structure. Large internal markets allow rapid iteration. Tight integration between software and industry accelerates adoption, and price competition forces constant improvement. In contrast, U.S. firms often rely on premium pricing and global reach. That works until competitors undercut you everywhere else. The EV story shows what happens next. Market share shifts, profit pools migrate, and leadership narratives collapse quietly before anyone admits it. This is why the AI debate cannot be separated from EVs. They are manifestations of the same underlying dynamic. Whoever masters application at scale wins, even if they do not lead every technical frontier. That is the uncomfortable precedent now hanging over AI. And it explains why American tech companies are starting to behave as if time is no longer on their side. Now we return to the moment where all of these pressures converged into a single, irreversible decision, because this is where theory turns into action. The move that shocked observers was not bold because it expanded ambition. It was bold because it acknowledged constraint. When a major U.S. tech company chose to integrate or acquire a China-founded AI solution, it was not conceding technological inferiority. It was conceding time. The internal math had changed. Building an application stack from scratch would take years, years of burn, years of investor patience, years of regulatory friction. That was no longer viable. What mattered now was immediate monetization and operational independence. The acquired system already had paying customers. It already fit into enterprise workflows. And most importantly, it was not dependent on rival ecosystems controlled by competitors. This is the hidden logic behind the trigger pull. The U.S. firm needed cash flow now, not theoretical dominance later. It needed something that could be plugged in and scaled without waiting for the next model breakthrough. And this is where the irony becomes unavoidable. The solution that offered speed, cost efficiency, and deployment readiness happened to originate from the very ecosystem that was supposed to be constrained. That does not mean China won. It means the system worked. When pressure rises, capital flows toward utility. Not ideology, not prestige, utility. This decision also reveals something deeper about the state of Silicon Valley. The era of endless experimentation is closing. The market no longer rewards patience without payoff. Integration beats invention when timelines compress. And that shift fundamentally alters behavior. Companies start buying instead of building. They prioritize independence over purity. They choose survival over symbolism. This is why the move matters far beyond one deal. It signals that U.S. tech leadership is entering a reactive phase, not collapsing, not disappearing, but adjusting under pressure. And once reaction replaces initiative, the balance of power subtly tilts. The firm did not pull the trigger because it wanted to. It pulled the trigger because waiting carried more risk than acting. And in strategic terms, that is always a revealing moment. So let us zoom out and look forward, because the outcome of this story is not predetermined. There are 3 plausible paths from here, and none of them are comfortable. The first path is adaptation. U.S. tech firms accept that models are commodities and pivot aggressively toward applications, partnerships, and monetization. In this scenario, they survive by narrowing margins but stabilizing cash flow. Leadership becomes shared rather than absolute. The second path is stagnation. Companies cling to the old narrative, continue overinvesting in capacity, and hope the market forgives them. In that case, capital continues to retreat and influence erodes quietly. The third path is the most counterintuitive: mutual dependence. U.S. firms rely increasingly on Chinese-originated applications, while China continues to rely on U.S.-adjacent platforms and markets. Neither side dominates. Both sides adapt. The system becomes interlinked rather than hierarchical. This would not look like victory or defeat. It would look like uneasy equilibrium. And here is the key variable across all three paths: time. The side that converts intelligence into utility faster gains leverage, not because it is smarter, but because it earns. Cash flow buys patience. Patience buys resilience. This is the lesson repeated across AI, EVs, and every capital-intensive technology cycle before it. The story was never about who builds the smartest system. It was about who builds the most useful one at scale. And that is why this moment matters. It tells us the game has moved from laboratories to balance sheets, from benchmarks to margins, from promise to proof. And once that transition happens, narratives collapse quickly. So here are the two questions that really matter. Will U.S. tech companies accept this shift fast enough to regain initiative? Or will they continue reacting while others set the tempo? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.